All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started, everyone. Welcome again to the first in the ISA 2023 Sapphire Series. I'm Deborah Avant, and I want to start by thanking Sarah Dorr and the ISA staff for all their help setting this up. Also the program team, Erica Chenoweth, Swati Parashar, Catherine Rajpura and Fissa Tefera, who all were really instrumental in help putting this panel and the two subsequent ones in place. So the Sapphire Series panels are all organized around our conference theme, which gives a nod to the rather fraught moment that we're in around the world. I mean, just this week, of course, we'll be noting the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There also are people still working on clearing the destruction away given the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. If I start going down the list of issues globally, it'll take the rest of the hour, so I won't do that. But as we've had a variety of conversations around our initiative this year on ISA in the world, it's become clear that people are thinking very hard about these issues, the challenges that they present, but also the opportunities. And so we decided to organize the Sapphire Series around that, pulling together people who might not otherwise converse. We were just talking ahead of time that none of us have actually met in person, though we all know of each other. And I think it should be a really interesting set of conversations. This is the first of three. There'll be another next Monday and the following Monday, and then we'll move into the conference week. Today we have a terrific panel chaired by our distinguished chair, Charli Carpenter from University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'm going to turn it over to her and turn my camera off and look forward to the conversation. So Charli, over to you.
Thank you, Debbie, for your opening remarks and for putting this panel together and inviting me to chair it. And welcome to the panelists. I'm looking forward to hearing your remarks in an important and timely discussion. And to the audience, I'll just say it's my great honor to introduce these three fine panelists, each of whom will have just a few minutes for opening remarks, after which I will moderate questions and provocations from the audience for as long as our time lasts. In the meantime, since this is a webinar format, those in the audience can feel free to begin putting your questions in the Q&A as the opening remarks commence. I believe you also have the ability to upvote one another's questions. So I will begin moderating the discussion by referring to the Q&A there. You will be hearing from, in alphabetical order, Errol Henderson of the Diasporas and Politics Project. Professor Henderson holds a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. He focuses on international relations. He's authored 50 scholarly publications, including 5 books, one of which is entitled African Realism, IR Theory and Africa's Wars in the Post-Colonial Era, which won Choice's Outstanding Academic Title Award. His latest book is on the role of religion in IR. It's called Scriptures, Shrines, Scapegoats, and World Politics. It's available free online through the Tome Initiative. There's a link he asked me to mention that I'll put in the chat momentarily. Good to have you here, Errol. Kasia Kaczmarska is a lecturer in politics and IR at University of Edinburgh School of Social and Political Science. She's an expert in and frequent commentator on Russia's foreign and security policy for LBC News, Coda Story, The Conversation, and other media outlets. Her research interests, however, center on knowledge construction among scholars and practitioners in international affairs. She's also interested in conceptualizations of and challenges to academic freedom, and is a member of the Academic Freedom Committee of the ISA, the European Coordinating Committee for Academic Freedom, and other academic freedom working groups. So looking forward to your remarks as well, Kasia. And of course, Paul Poast is an associate professor at Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. His research on international relations and quantitative methodology has been funded by the National Science Foundation and has appeared in every possible journal, AJPS, IO, World Politics, etc. Paul received his PhD from the University of Michigan. His dissertation won the Peace Science Society's Walter Eisner Award. And he is, as most of you probably know, also one of the most read members of IR's Twitterati. Well, I'd like to welcome warmly all of you to this discussion and invite you to deliver your remarks in reverse alphabetical order, beginning with Paul Poast. And I'll just reiterate briefly the key questions for this panel. What are the most serious high-stakes struggles members of the ISA community face? Many of these are outlined in this year's call for proposals, including catastrophic climate change, ever-morphing global pandemics, widening democratic decline, et cetera, including alongside deeply entrenched systemic racism and sexism, and concerns about increasing violence and geopolitical rivalry, war, etc. So how should we best think about these or other issues that are on top of your mind? And how can we as a scholarly community best respond? I'll turn it over to you, Professor Poast.
Well, thank you. And Charli, thank you so much for that great introduction. I'm really thrilled to be part of this, to have been invited to be part of this, to speak today, and of course, to be on a great panel with my fellow panelists. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. What I thought I would do for my remarks is to kind of think about these challenges and opportunities, if you will, in the context of course, the major event that we're marking this week, which is by Friday, the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And over the past year, since that invasion, there's been a number of, if you will, opportunities and challenges that I think that this invasion has highlighted that we as researchers of international studies should be thinking about, be aware of, trends, if you will. And I thought that maybe a useful way to frame this would be in the context of the subtitle for this talk, which was Cooperation, Contention, and Creativity. And so that's what I want to talk about here for just a few minutes to hopefully kind of frame some things. So in terms of thinking about what does it mean to study cooperation, given what we've been witnessing over the past year since Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And for me, the one thing that's really jumped out has been the, if you will, the coalition that has supported Ukraine. But what that coalition supporting Ukraine tells us about how we have thought about international cooperation. And specifically, I think the best phrase I could bring up here is liberal international order, right? This is a phrase that indeed so prominent that the International Organization 75th anniversary special issue framed it very much around this entire concept. But I think what the war in Ukraine has highlighted is that the liberal international order is really in many ways a Western order. And that you see a lot of the countries that have been banding to help Ukraine are not necessarily countries that would have said that they agree or even recognize this order. Because if you look at countries that have chosen to stay out of that, if you look at countries that maybe do not condone what Russia has done, but are not trying to actively oppose it, these are countries largely in what we're now calling the global South, right? And we see this most prominently in an institution, BRICS, right? We're seeing that with Brazil. We're seeing that with India. We're seeing this with China. We're seeing this with South Africa. We're seeing these countries kind of taking a stand of, well, we're not necessarily on board with this whole liberal international order that is really a US-led, a Western-led order. And I think that that's one thing that maybe a few years ago, we had a view as scholars of, oh, well, we have to talk about the liberal international order. We maybe even look at this through rose-tinted, glasses, and realizing that I think the war has kind of highlighted how that is not a universal thing, and that there is actually a lot more contestation about that concept and what that means for when we're studying that concept. So that's the first thing that comes out for me that I think the war has highlighted. And the second one is contention. And for me, what this has highlighted is that security studies has not gone anywhere. If anything, this is a big trend that, of course, I think in the 90s, and of course, recently, Robert Cohen wrote a piece for the American Review of Political Science talking about study of cooperation in easy times. and as well as hard times. And he talked about how the 1990s was an easy time for it because that was the end of the Cold War. And people said, well, that's it. Security studies is not something we really need to think much about. And instead, we can focus on the global economy. We can focus on international institutions. And of course, since that time, we've seen a number of events that lead questions to that, maybe have shifted things. But if anything, it's shifted it to the study of, say, non-state actors in violence. It's shifted the study to civil wars. But what we're now seeing is, of course, something that in Europe, at least, hadn't been seen in a long time, which is a classic interstate war conventionally fought. And that shows that this is still something that maybe was viewed as an older strand of international studies, but yet is still extremely relevant. And in fact, if anything, we're witnessing where there wasn't maybe the same level of expertise that we needed because of the fact that we kind of lost sight of this. So I think that that's a second thing that I'm noticing that is both a challenge and opportunity, is that this war is highlighting the continued relevance of kind of, if you will, classic security studies as a field of inquiry. And then the final thing that I'd highlight is creativity. And this is something that I've seen a lot of discussion about with coverage as well as commentary regarding the war in Ukraine, and particularly when academics have been brought in. I've seen kind of the two extremes. I've seen some people that say, well, unless you actually lived in Ukraine and speak the language, you can't say anything about this war. Now, that's obviously a very extreme view, but I've heard that view. I've also heard the opposite. People are saying, well, you don't really need to know anything about the specifics of what's going on there. It's just all great power politics, and we can just think about it in the context of that, right? And I think what we realize is that neither of those extremes are actually useful for gaining an understanding of what's truly happening. And I think that what this has highlighted is something that was already a trend, but that is creative merger of both in-depth qualitative work as well as broader general concepts and even quantitative work, and how those can be brought together. For example, it is important to be able to understand the positions of not just Ukraine and their government and the history there, but also how other Eastern European countries have been viewing the situation. At the same time, one of the big things that's been of great insight, I think, to a lot of people is being able to position this war and the level of violence we're seeing in this war in the context of other wars, say in terms of the intensity, the number of fatalities. And that's a quantitative question. And that's something that scholars of, say, conflict processes have been able to bring context to. So that's where I see the third one is kind of that this war and the way that we can talk about it and the way we can understand it really points to the value of creative mergers of both in-depth qualitative knowledge as well as higher end quantitative knowledge. So that's what I take as like three challenges and opportunities that I think over the past year, the war in Ukraine has highlighted as directions that scholars of international studies can pursue going forward. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the rest of our conversation this morning.
Thank you, Paul. Those were great opening remarks for this panel. I'll turn it now over to Professor Kaczmarska.
Thank you, Charli, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I would like to speak about academic freedom, which I consider to be the key opportunity for international studies. And quite plainly, academic freedom simply allows us to think, research, publish, and teach about all the high-stakes struggles we face and which have been outlined in this year's called for proposals, such as climate change, global pandemics, democratic decline, economic inequality, war, and racism. I believe academic freedom is also a precious resource. It is one of the important macro lenses which we can use, for instance, to assess the state of democracy and the advancement of populism. And here it is where academic freedom's steep decline around the world presents a challenge. Importantly, while the term academic freedom may suggest a universal meaning, it represents and exposes very different challenges in countries around the world. Paul has just mentioned the war in Ukraine, and over the past year, Ukraine has been suffering the destruction of physical infrastructure for learning and teaching. In Russia, on the other hand, with the regime's relentless crackdown on academic freedom, many of those who could think critically about the future of the country have now left. In Britain, Dr. Kojo Koram predicts that the university is likely to be a political battleground in 2023. These are but 3 examples that I am most familiar with due to my positionality and research focus. But Scholars at Risk, which is an international network promoting academic freedom, in the Free to Think 2022 report, documented close to 400 attacks on higher education communities in 65 countries and territories. My colleagues who are supported by the Scholars at Risk Mellon Fellowship have been carrying out in-depth research projects into current academic freedom struggles in Kenya, Brazil, Colombia, and Bangladesh. There is at least one more reason for why academic freedom matters to international studies. This principle has been moving from the exclusive realm of university governance towards becoming part of global governance, with more and more international bodies articulating its definitions and proposing arrangements for its protection. Among those are UNESCO, the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Council of Europe, the European Union. But back to the International Studies Association community. While academic freedom represents a fundamental value to all scholars, it has never been among the key research concerns for the discipline of IR. Institutionally, the discipline is prepared to take a stance and voice concerns through the ISA Academic Freedom Committee, but many of us will remember the most recent ISA statement on women's access to higher education and academic freedom in Afghanistan. Still, academic freedom remains at the margins of our publishing and teaching, and this is despite the fact that the discipline of IR has invested considerable effort into the study of its own knowledge production practices. This research has been pursued under one of the 3 headings, revisiting the disciplinary boundaries, reflexivity, and theoretical pluralism. Those inquiries have stopped short of exploring the context of knowledge making. Questions of academic freedom form an important part of that context. New research directions such as global IR, while rightly advocating for sourcing international politics knowledge from around the globe, need to be more attuned to academic freedom challenges many scholars face, as well as to the processes and repercussions of knowledge co-production between academia and the state in many parts of the world. Populism, anti-intellectualism, and different forms of governmental control constitute a challenge to knowledge making. They are therefore consequential for our thinking about what international relations knowledge is and how certain research directions may be obscured. We should not assume that academic freedom will be dealt with by our colleagues in higher education studies. And before the floor opens for further discussion, I would like to conclude with a brief manifesto. Academic freedom, while undoubtedly an interdisciplinary research area, requires careful engagement from IR scholars. Our disciplinary outlets should be ready to publish on the subject, and I also believe we should think more about incorporating academic freedom into our own teaching. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kasia. And finally, Errol Henderson.
I want to thank you all for coming, and thank all my the panelists and the chair, especially Professor Carpenter, who insisted on mentioning my African realism book, which was not even reviewed by Perspectives in Politics. I often say that folks who do quantitative analysis often don't explore racism, and those who analyze racism rarely explore quantitative analysis, but even fewer would deign to derive international relations theory from analysis of Africa. So I really appreciate that, Professor Carpenter, that you would mention my book, African Realism. And my co-panelists as well, Professor Kaczmarska, what you just said about academic freedom. I really encourage folks to read, if you can find an op-ed I wrote called Being Black at Penn State. And Professor Poast, I don't think we've ever met, but I so appreciate, I'm not on social media, but I've seen some of your Twitter posts about my work. And I really appreciate that, because I don't know you. And I so appreciate, and I wanted to say that. And I read I don't want to date myself. I have a problem. I just don't want to date the other person. But Professor Avant's research has been very interesting to me over the years. And if I have the time, you'll see my appreciation for Professor Carpenter's research that she doesn't even know about. Okay, Professor Carpenter, can I take that as an intro and now start my 5 minutes? Because I like to read something because one, I'm trying to get a job. Okay. I got my timer on. Can I do that, Professor Carpenter?
All right, as long as your timer is set to 5 minutes.
It's on 5 minutes. Starting now, Professor Carpenter, on my honor.
Very good.
I say, in a famous, though often poorly contextualized quote, IR scholar Jack Levy asserted that the democratic peace is as close as anything we have to an empirical law in world politics. Less famously, but even more resolutely, Bruce Russett maintained that the democratic peace thesis was one of the strongest non-trivial or non-tautological generalizations that could be made about international relations. They were both wrong. Then as now, a much better candidate for the moniker of closest thing to an empirical law or most robust generalization in IR is the phenomena that we observe within and across states, that wherever you find sizable numbers of whites and blacks in states and international institutions across the globe, those who are white and associated with whiteness occupy the superordinate position, and those who are black and associated with blackness occupy the subordinate position. This phenomena, this banality of white supremacy, is neither random, natural, or inconsequential, but yet empirical examinations of this global phenomena are rarely found in our most prestigious, widely cited, or highly ranked mainstream scholarly publications, or discussed in plenary sessions at our mainstream IR conferences, or addressed in required reading and syllabi of mainstream IR courses. The banality of white supremacy, for short, I call it BOWS, B-O-O-W-S, BOWS. The banality of white supremacy phenomenon is evident at the system, dyadic, and state levels, and across swaths of individuals and groups within states and international regimes, international trade, economic relations, IGOs, NGOs, TNCs, MNCs, whatever alphabets you got, terrorist groups, drug cartels, etc. Yet this most prominent empirical regularity remains one of the most understudied aspects of world politics among those conducting empirical work across the spectrum of quantitative, case study, and interpretive analysis in IR. This absence results in part because the banality of white supremacy as an empirical regularity in world politics generates a concomitant among IR scholars, the norm against noticing, which is Vitalis's characterization of the propensity within mainstream IR discourse to dismiss, ignore, and or fail to acknowledge, much less engage, white supremacism in world politics. Vitalis drew the term from Toni Morrison's critique of the silence and evasion of race in literary discourse. He might have added that the Nobel laureate characterized this type of erasure as a kind of trembling hypochondria, always curing itself with unnecessary surgery. And parallel to what we often find in mainstream IR, moderated if not governed by the norm against noticing, Morrison recognizes for literary theory that criticism that needs to insist that literature is not only universal, but also race-free, risks lobotomizing that literature and diminishes both the art and the artist. Similarly, white racism in world politics militates against the banality of white supremacy being acknowledged, much less analyzed in mainstream IR. This condition obtains because white supremacy, the empirical condition, is accompanied and reinforced by white supremacism, the prominent form of racism in the global system. One may think of white supremacy as a description of a status of white racial dominance, whereas white supremacism as a form of racism is fluid, insofar as its justifications may range from the theological, biological, anthropological to the sociological, and its practices fluctuate from Jim Crow discrimination, apartheid, racial slavery, racial imperialism to genocide. Let's be clear about the terms before proceeding. Racism is the belief, practice, and policy of domination based on the specious concept of race. It's not simply bigotry or prejudice, but public and private practice typically supported by institutional power, especially state power. White supremacism is a form of racism that presupposes the inherent superiority of people designated as white, and among other things, justifies the construction and maintenance of systems, institutions, and relationships to perpetuate this superiority. It's the latter, white supremacism, which prevents, precludes, and punishes acknowledgement of, engagement with, or challenges to white supremacy in IR that are as obvious as they are ignored. Thus, our focus is on racism, the power relationship, not race, the specious concept. Race is an unscientific concept as a noun, and it doesn't become scientific as an adjective. The discussion of race refers to perceptions of people as social groups, while that of racism focuses on the power relations of people thus associated. Appreciating the distinction between white supremacy and white supremacism. And given the definition of racism and white supremacism, it should be clear that the banality of white supremacy thesis asserts that the persistent superordinate position of whites and subordinate position of blacks across the global system is a result of white supremacism, the dominant form of racism in the global system. It is this banality of white supremacy thesis, rather than the democratic peace thesis, which is the closest thing to an empirical law in world politics. How's that for my time?
You did well, and thank you for those very powerful remarks. Wow. Well, I already have a question in Q&A, which we can jump to in a moment, but I wanted to pause and just allow the panelists, if you want to take a moment to respond to sort of respond synthetically to the opening remarks. If any of you would like to follow up, linking the concepts that you're thinking of to any of the concepts raised by the other two speakers before we launch the discussion, I'll give you that opportunity. Yeah, Paul.
I can jump in. I think that in some ways, and this actually, I think even ties in, I was taking a look at the question that's already in the Q&A. And I think that what Errol just said very much ties into that first point that I raised and ties into the question that's in the Q&A, right? Which is this notion of the liberal international order, how we're supposed to be thinking about that. And as the question, the Q&A is highlighting of like, why is it that it seems like there's a lot of talking past, right? There's, and we're referring to not even so much like from a rivalry standpoint, because I think that consumes a lot, that takes up a lot of the oxygen in the room, right? Of kind of US-China relations and great power rivalry. But thinking about countries like India, who is sitting there like, well, we're not in a rivalry situation, but we're not buying into this. And why is that? And I think that part of it is due to kind of the dynamics that Errol was just talking about, which is that the liberal international order, or we could say Western international order, can also be perceived very much along racial terms, right? And that's also not I think a hugely controversial thesis. I think that there's been a lot of work, especially even recent work, that's been looking at that and looking at kind of the racial dynamics that led to the creation of the liberal international order, the type of institutions, some of that being due to the US's dominant position, or, as will be pointed out, an Anglo-American dominance, and that it's very much an Anglo-American international order. And then as a result, kind of viewing it as, well, this is a global order, but it's not a global order. It's like most of the globe is not actually viewing it as something that they've had a say in or buy into. And I think that that dynamic very much does play into why it is that countries are now viewing the current war as an opportunity to kind of say, yes, look, here's case in point of where we're not going to just simply go along. We can actually have a position. We actually have a choice. We can choose to be very much down to brass tacks. We can choose to buy energy from Russia. You can't tell us not to buy energy from Russia because we think that's in our interest. And I think that this is something that for a long time has been taken for granted because it hasn't been viewed as much as I think it's true that there's this empirical regularity about international politics that we haven't paid attention to. And then where I think that this ties into academic freedom is very much the notion of having the ability to be able to ask these questions, study these questions, right? And have ability for that to be respected. And I think that's a big challenge that we're witnessing. There are some places where it's hard to study these questions, but of course, we are also seeing with all of the controversy, even if it's manufactured controversy around critical race theory and how that's being used and politicized in the United States, could someone trying to study these topics fall susceptible to that type of attack, right? And so I think that this does, I think in that way, that was how my mind was kind of linking together everything that was just brought up, bringing together both Errol's comments as well as Kasia's comments.
Mm-hmm. Kasia?
Right, thank you so much, Paul and Errol. I think I'd like to refer immediately to Errol's remark, which he shared with us at the very beginning of his talk. He suggested we look at a document called Being Black at Penn State. And what I did, I did what we all do. At first, I Googled it to be able to access it and read it. And here is a small problem. So the document is unavailable due to legal reasons. So it's a letter to the editor. I can see from my Google outcome that it's been published around 2019, but I can't access it. So I believe it speaks to our, I don't know the reasons for it, but the legal in it is sort of peculiar. It speaks to our access to information, to what we can say and who will be able to access it and read it. So I think it ties very well with the question of academic freedom around the globe. Thanks very much, Errol. I will do my best to access this document.
I will send you a copy of it. I think it's for reasons of advertisements or something in there. But I also can comment. On advice of my lawyers, I can't comment, but I've just settled a federal lawsuit with regard to racial discrimination at Penn State University. Another reason why, but I can't speak more to that. But that is a public document, and public documents, even those associated with filings for lawsuits, are public information. But I want to say, I don't know if am I breaking up, Charli?
I can hear you well enough.
Okay. I wanted to say, but just a brief, to Paul's point, this, and thank you, may I call you Kasia, Professor Kaczmarska? I really appreciate that. And to Paul's point, it's one of the reasons why folks are talking about the Ukrainian war, as they should, but the Ethiopian war is much more intense. They're much more it's much more severe with respect to fatalities. And people may say, well, the war in Tigray, okay, but it's Ethiopia. Here you have one in the heart of Europe where World War II began. Well, you can argue that World War II also begins in Ethiopia with the Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. You can also start it with the Marco Polo incident in Asia, to be sure. But the focus on Ethiopia is quite different than the focus on Ukraine. And these are choices. And for some of us who are challenging white supremacism, not simply theoretically, ideation, but in our own institutions. And I would argue these are things we can affect right now as professors. But these are the very things that many of the professors who will discuss, as we should, issues all and I'm thinking in the United States now, issues all around the world, the struggles of professors in their own departments or the struggles of professors in their own universities get short shrift. And I want to be clear, I don't do advocacy, I do accuracy. I don't teach advocacy in my class, I teach accuracy. Now, accuracy may sound to you like advocacy, that's your problem, you see? But I teach, and I'm dogmatically against dogma and absolutely against absolutes. So I think that the notion of bringing empirical theory to bear to our issues, empirical theory to change an empirical reality that so many of us experience. So I really appreciate the sort of methodological pluralism that Paul was talking about, and the notions of academic freedom abroad and all the way to our department meetings. Okay, so.
Thank you. So I'll go to the Q&A now, and I'm gonna, I actually will begin with Marion Foster's comment, Paul, even though I think you touched on it. I want to make sure that she has heard as much as she wanted to hear. So if you had anything else, also just so that anyone not looking at the Q&A can see what she wrote. The first comment in the Q&A is from Marion Foster, and she writes that she has a question for Professor Poast on the observation on the liberal international order. It seems not only do we see a large number of actors don't buy into it, but that members of the liberal order and those who remain outside it increasingly talk past each other in diverging rhetoric and narratives about what the situation is, what to do about it. What, if anything, can international studies as a field contribute to chances of real dialogue between these diverging narratives? Do you have anything else you wanted to say specifically to this question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question for tying in, actually, a lot of the themes here. So I'm really glad that Marion asked the question. I think the one thing that I haven't touched on was kind of like, well, what can we as scholars do, right? And I think that's kind of like the second part of that question was kind of pointing to, what, if anything, can international studies as a field contribute to the chances for it? And I think part of it is already being highlighted by what Errol just pointed out, which is that we have a tendency to dismiss conflicts that are not happening. I mean, are we contributing, if you will, to kind of the perception of a conflict that's happening in Europe is worthy of massive attention? A conflict happening in Africa is just old news and we don't talk about it, right? And I think that that's something that we as scholars can do more of. You know, can we make, for example, can we make areas that maybe traditionally weren't viewed as sources of developing IR theory, sources for being able to test our theories? Can we start to make that more prominent, right? And specifically thinking about Africa, you know, and not only the war in Ethiopia, but just in December, at the end of the year, I write a column and I highlighted in that column that maybe the war that we should be talking about more is renewed conflict in Congo, between Rwanda and Congo, that may actually be eventually a larger war than what we're witnessing in Ukraine. But yet it's another war that we're not talking much about, right? And so what can we as scholars make sure that we're bringing awareness to this? And I think that there's already been trends towards this of kind of being more aware of our Eurocentrism, right? You know, that it's like, is balance of power theory great? Okay, that's a nice theory, but is it just a European theory? Would we have developed it in the same way if it had been developed somewhere else? So I think that's one thing that we can do as scholars, is to make sure that our own work is kind of reflecting the idea that it's not being just solely Eurocentric. And to give you like a very concrete example of this, I think this has been something that I've been pleased with, but that is work looking at, say, the decline of war thesis, right? And I think if you look at that work, it is very much, and I know that there's people who study this that would disagree with this, but my view of this, and I think that this was something that Tanisha Fazal and I highlighted in a foreign affairs piece that we had a few years ago, where if you look at it, that work has a tendency to put a lot of weight on European wars, and specifically World War I, World War II, and not as much weight on wars outside of Europe, right? And then that leads you to come up with a decline of war thesis and talking about how, oh, violence is declining around the world. But I think that that's the kind of, if you will, could be Eurocentric view, Western-centric view that we as scholars need to be aware that we need to do a better job of backing away from. So that would be kind of my second, that would be my way of kind of saying, what can we as scholars do in terms of helping to create a better dialogue in that is not as Western-centric, not as focused on just the states that are in the liberal international order.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Paul. I'm reminded of Bear Braumeller's talk on his book about the decline of war thesis and why he's skeptical of it. And some of the references to major interstate wars in Latin America, for example, between Paraguay and Bolivia in the 1930s that I never heard about when I was in all my years of grad study in the 1990s, with the focus that we had on World War I, for example. So it's a really good point. Did anyone else on the panel want to tackle this first question before we go to the second? It was directed to Paul, but if Errol or Kasia also have thoughts on the answer to this question. If not, we can go on. You can always loop back to it if you like. But there's another question in the Q&A by Nazia Khan. Writes, as a global South scholar who is a first-generation scholar, I want to bring to focus mental health. We talked about academic freedom curtailment and declining democracy. It also takes a toll for a person from a minority group to not only handle rejections within academia, but curbing of academic freedom as a free thinker. What are your thoughts on this? I think this question is directed to the entire panel. Kasia.
If I may start, I'd say that this is a very good and pertinent question. It very much speaks to our experiences as scholars of international politics. And of course, scholars are targeted not only because of the content of their work, but also because of their status. And this status differs massively. And is perceived by different societies differently. And by status, I mean education, professional standing, public profile. But it is also true that scholars who are members of traditionally marginalized groups, especially women, especially ethnic and religious minorities, LGBTI communities, they are at an even greater risk of having their academic freedom undermined. This status seems to be exacerbating risks that scholars who do not share those features are also facing. And of course, it is putting enormous pressure on scholars' mental health, and not only scholars. We should also emphasize that students are very much part of the academic community and should be regarded as part of that community and protected by academic freedom. And their mental health is of course as important as scholars' mental health. So absolutely crucial issues for us to be able to do the work we are supposed to be doing, to teach, to produce research on international politics. Thank you for that question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that answer. I don't know if Errol or Paul have any other thoughts on that. I would just jump in and ask a follow-up if I might. Kasia, maybe you would be interested in responding to this. There is, of course, the wider question of intersectionality and race and gender and mental health. But I'm also thinking that there are contexts where we may be systematically overlooking some of these issues, looping back to the Ukraine war, for example. And I'm glad that you brought up the issue of students as sort of stakeholders in academic freedom debates, as well as scholars, Kasia. One of the key things that I think is so under-mentioned in the coverage of the war in Ukraine is this gender-specific travel ban that has trapped the civilian men and boys of Ukraine inside a shooting war. Even those who are not mobilized or conscripted, nor likely to be anytime soon, they can't leave. And students is one huge population here. College students from international universities that had gone home for break before the war broke out have been stuck there and have been unable to continue their education. And of course, these are primarily young men who are subject to the ban, but it also affects trans women, for example. And some of them are very vulnerable. And as civilians, they're all vulnerable in this war, but they're unable to pursue their education. And so it's an interesting question. This is not a population we tend to study in human rights. It's kind of an issue that is arisen now. But it also makes me wonder what you guys think about the responsibility of the International Studies Association as an academic association to be seized of and or involved in advocating for individuals in those contexts, not just scholars at risk, but students at risk as well. I'm curious if the panel has any thoughts on that from a mental health perspective, again, building on Nazia's question. And if not, it's just food for thought. Yeah.
I could start perhaps, Charli.
Yeah.
It does speak to a very important problem of the internationalization of higher education. We got used to the idea that we can travel as scholars and students abroad to do research or to undertake studies. And it is not as simple as we assumed it could be, or at least it's simple for parts of the world. Or it used to be simple for parts of the world. However, what is even more important is how we think we might be helping. There have been a number of scholarships announced for students of Ukraine. Very seldomly have there been initiatives that could be undertaken by those who cannot leave the country. So I'm thinking about in-place scholarships, so without the need to travel, so that you can continue your education from abroad. This has not been a regular offering, even though there has been a mass mobilization of help and support for students in Ukraine. So the way we want to help also matters because of the circumstances, which we just have to understand better before we start thinking about how to help.
Well, let's go to another question from the
Oh.
chat. Oh, sorry, Paul, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I didn't see.
No, it's totally fine, totally fine. It's always like, when you raise hand, do I use the raise hand function? You think by now we would have Zoom mastered. What I was just going to add to this is when thinking about this issue, thinking about accessibility, especially for scholars who, as pointed out, are maybe located in countries, in regions where travel is not as easy or even possible. This is something that I think all of us maybe have witnessed recently, especially all of us who are involved in social media in some way, especially with Twitter. This is something that I've observed is, of course, a few months ago, a bunch of us became very concerned when Elon Musk took ownership of Twitter. And a number of people said that they were going to, well, that's unacceptable. Can't be part of this, can't associate with this. My concern, admittedly, wasn't so much about Musk himself. It was more, is he just going to cause the whole thing to fall apart? That was more my concern, but rather than a stance against it. But what I noticed, and I was talking to some other people noticed, was that conversation was only among scholars from the West. That the scholars from other regions, and I even had people reach out to say, I'm at an institution in Global South. Twitter is how I'm staying involved. That is how I'm staying engaged. That's how I'm able to interact with someone who's at a Western university. That's how I'm able to stay involved because of travel, because of other opportunities. So what I noticed was that one thing we can do, and I think that, this is something that ISA is doing, is continue to foster that social media presence, because I think that's something that we maybe overlook. We think of social media as like a way to publicize our work. We think of it as a way to say witty things, but it's like, no, for a lot of people, this is their form of engagement because they don't have these other opportunities. And they were like, look, we don't care if Elon Musk owns this or whoever owns it. This is the platform, and we're going to be working through this platform. So that's one thing that I think we can be doing, and that maybe is important for us to be aware of as an organization.
Thank you, Paul. A good reason to stay engaged on Twitter rather than float over to Mastodon, perhaps. All right, I've got a question from Laura Doyle, which I think is directed to anyone on the panel who wants to tackle it. She writes, one can call the Western liberal order the neo-colonial white supremacist IR order, and we should add masculinist, another empirical banality. One concrete way for ISA to address these issues is to start reading and assigning two kinds of work: history told from anti-racist decolonial intersectional lens, and the century or more of careful global IR that has long been concretely addressing, but which the field has overlooked in their norm against noticing. Do any of you have reflections on this? The wider question of pedagogy in IR, I think.
Yes, I don't think I support a range of approaches, but I don't think any of that is necessary. Let me say, a short précis on the importance of white supremacism in IR just involves 4 questions, okay? Not trick questions, basic, okay? So we don't need complexified answers. So, is international war a major focus of IR? I think the general answer would be yes. Is that fair to say? Okay.
Yeah.
What was the most destructive war in human history? It's fair to say it's World War II, okay? We know we don't accept monocausal models or theories of war, but if we could say there was one person most responsible for turning those conflicts that we call World War II into World War II, who would that one person be? If we say one, I think it's fair to say most would say Adolf Hitler. Now, were Adolf Hitler's policies white supremacists? Yes. So here we go. So white supremacism was a prominent factor in the most destructive international war in human history, the study of such wars being a major focus of IR, then white supremacism is central to IR. You don't need Foucault for that. You don't need Derrida for that. You don't need bell hooks for that. It's as mainstream. So the question becomes, when it's the sort of we problem. I also do IR. This is what I do. I don't put the chairs in a circle. I don't tell students you have to open your third eye. You don't complexify and mystify this stuff. So I'm not wasting time dealing with folks who pretend to be strategically ignorant about this. And I don't agree that you just lump all these types of oppressions together. I challenge you, whatever mode of oppression you got, sexism, ableism, religious discrimination, transphobia, homophobia, make that person Black, and you have the lowest of the low. So it's not a simple binary. When you challenge white supremacism, it's like the equivalent, the IR equivalent of what Anna Julia Cooper said, when and where I enter, the whole race enters with me. If you overturn that one, it's going to restructure all those in the middle. You see, it's not ignoring those. And this strategic ignorance, we can deal with this yesterday with our colleagues in the department. Don't ask me, why does Henderson focus on feminism in world politics? How do you discuss it without women? How do you do that? How do you discuss world politics without white supremacism and racism? Go ask the white professors how you do that. I don't have a special name for what I do. I'm not anti-racist, critical this. I just teach political science. I don't need a special name for me. I think Christopher Hitchens said this about his atheism. He says, I don't have a name for not believing in Santa Claus. I don't call myself an anti-Clausian. I teach world politics. I don't know what those other folks are teaching. And the last point I'll make is that why don't they do it? I say strategic ignorance even makes the present research subject to inordinate evidentiary demands from those whose cognitive dissonance compelled them to pretend that the white supremacism operative in the very academic institutions in which they serve is somehow absent from the products of these institutions, including their chosen field of study, including the journals, the editors. This is important. This may result from Charli Carpenter's social proximity to alleged perpetrators thesis, which describes a reticence to apply normative prescriptions to institutions and or individuals that one identifies with positively. And I think this is something we can affect right now as scholars in our own scholarship. How many of your colleagues teach white supremacism and its centrality the way I just did with respect to World War II? I would argue that very few. We can change this yesterday, and in so doing, develop our students' analytical ability, because the lack of that analytical ability that gets you the trumps, that get you the type of idiotic arguments you see, because white supremacism is at the bedrock of there. Finally, why do we oppose white supremacy? I don't have a moral argument for you. I don't oppose that. I don't have a normative argument for it. I got an empirical one. You know why I oppose it? Because it's wrong. It's empirically incorrect. And that should be the basis. That's why you don't have to do advocacy. I'm not knocking you if you do, but that's not where I'm coming from. White supremacism goes to the heart of this. It's wrong. That's why it's incorrect empirically. That's why we challenge it.
Thank you. Thank you, Errol. And I want to just say in response to your question, how many of my colleagues teach this? I mean, I would say hearteningly, more and more, including those who you would least expect to do so, and certainly still not enough. I would also just add into the range of characteristics and attributes and complexity and nuances that you're pointing to, although, as you say, in some ways it's actually quite simple. Beyond race, there's also colorism, and some of the most interesting research that is coming out now from one of my colleagues here at UMass, who studies diversity in global elites, and is finding very much, it's again empirical support for your hypothesis, sir, is that he's finding not only racial hierarchies in global elites and gender hierarchies, but also hierarchies of color, just depending on like how dark someone's skin is. It's really fascinating how the numbers are there. We do need to be looking at it. And
I want to challenge that colorism is not white supremacism. That's very important. And whatever numbers you got, I've been doing this almost 30 years. I've never found a white colleague who talks about white supremacism like this. They'll talk about race relations. They have some euphemism for it. So I challenge, and more, when you start from a zero, of course, from 1 to 2 is 100%. The percentages or more and more doesn't tell us. You can count, I would argue, in one hand, and coming to ISA conferences for almost 30 years, I've never heard a white professor, much less talk about white supremacy, and definitely not a mainstream one, or definitely not those who do empirical analysis. You won't find in compendiums of racism, of correlates of war, and I've been on the correlates of war project for since 1986, scholars who talk about white supremacism. It's constantly some euphemism. And so I want to stop there, but I want to make it very clear, because what I worry about is people turn my argument into some type of liberal. I'm not making a liberal argument, because you got liberal white supremacism as well as you have other types, all the way through Marxism. So more and more is not sufficient. White supremacism is wrong. It's empirically incorrect. And I challenge you, bring me the professor who does what I just did with those 4 questions, because I didn't just come up with this at the top of my head. And this is from my analysis for over 30 years of doing this, not just with myself and not just with Black professors. Bring me one white professor who does that.
All right, perhaps you and I can discuss it over coffee at ISA.
I hope ISA can discuss it in a bigger forum.
Now,
how about that?
Well, I also wanted to follow up on Laura Doyle's question, give the other panelists an opportunity to engage with her. She added to her question in the chat, asking specifically about key works of this kind over the century that you, or perhaps more recently, in more recent scholarship, that you folks might include or recommend that might be included on syllabi. Kasia or Paul, did you have thoughts on this one?
I know you didn't call on me. Undesirable Immigrants by Andrew Rosenberg at the University of Florida uses quantitative analysis centered on the theoretical arguments of the Howard School and talks about white supremacism, not race, not racist, not race relations. That's Andrew Weisenberg, a quantitative piece. Princeton University published it. Okay, there are some excellent works. If we stop saying we to just mean white folks, and the scholarship is there, but it's often hidden in plain sight as well. Some of the excellent work from the Cambridge, from Alex Anivas, I'm sorry, just getting glare, and Robbie Shilliam and Neva Mashanda on white supremacism. And we already understand the intersectional approaches, but some of the most, some of the biggest conduits of white supremacism in academia are white women who replicate what white men have done. And then what they get away with is saying, is talking about feminism, feminist arguments, while they maintain white supremacism. That's why I don't believe you just conflate these together. That's not intersectionality. That's not what Fran Beal or Kimberly Crenshaw were talking about, much less Lucy Parsons. What we're talking about is white supremacism, which is at the root of this, and to target it specifically, because to overthrow white supremacism is to overthrow the political, economic, and social bases. And that's why these other approaches, you can have, you have suffragists who are white supremacists, you have Marxists who are white supremacists. So I want to be clear on that and what I'm talking about. And this is what's not in the mainstream journals. I want to be clear. And I also want to say, I'm not yelling at folks. I'm the youngest of 13. If I didn't talk loud, I didn't get food, okay? It's not personal, and I'm not angry. And people say, I respect your passion, like as if there's no analytical part of what I said. Look, I'm a happy guy. I'm happy right now to be with you all, but I want to emphasize, because this is often so silenced. And one of the ways it's silenced is turning attack on white supremacism into colorism, gender. No, I want to talk about this and stay here and talk about challenging white supremacism, because all the other ones have been addressed. And what do you have? White supremacism persistent. That's the one that's still here. And that's why I emphasize that.
Thank you, Errol. I don't know if you were speaking to me. I think you may have been misunderstanding me if you think that I was disputing your point. I think I agree with it and I was building on it. But again, we can talk about it offline. Kasia and Paul, I don't know if you have more for Laura Doyle. If so, let me know. If not, we'll go to the next question on the list. Paul?
Oh, I would just say, I would also, I mean, if we're talking about other work, I think if I had this about the global IR and other work, I mean, I should just say, Errol highlighted this at the very beginning that I've highlighted his work, but I encourage people to read Errol's work, especially in this regard. I think a key topic that a lot of us as IR scholars, and indeed, if we want to bring it back to thinking about themes that have been brought out through the war in Ukraine, has been, you have seen once again this rhetoric about clash of civilizations. Does the war in Ukraine highlight a clash of civilizations? And Errol has done just tremendous quantitative work of testing this over the years. And I draw on that work a lot to show the students of like, here's, you know, we're not going to just dismiss this thesis, but let's actually see if there's a there with it. And I think that that's a great, his work is a great example of kind of how we can go about this in a way of, as Errol was saying, just dealing with the facts and let's actually analyze it here. So that would be work that I would recommend.
Yeah. Kasia.
And the question was, if I understood it correctly, also about global IR, and here Professor Acharya work is definitely to be recommended. I also wanted to recommend Robbie Shilliam's work on decolonizing politics. It's an introductory work, so very much approachable for students of politics and international politics.
And I'll just throw in my suggestion also to look at Zoltan Buzas's work on race and IR. He's got some great articles in IO that are more theoretical, and then he has a fascinating book about ways in which race comes into play in international human rights policy, as well as some emerging work on nuclear politics. So yeah, again, I think that it's possible to really bring this subject into the mainstream study of many issues in IR. When I'm building my syllabi, my strategy is always not to compartmentalize it on a specific week, but to try to find ways to mainstream this perspective from different lenses and different methodologies throughout the syllabus. So I strongly encourage that. Paul, you had another thought?
Yeah, I just wanted, since everybody's holding up books to recommend, I wanted to recommend another one, though it gets blotted out here, but there is a recent edited volume. Well, it's not an edited volume, it's collected works. It's by Adam Getachew and Jennifer Pitts on W.E.B. Du Bois and international thought. And it's a collection of his works and how his work speaks to international thought, international relations. This was just published by Cambridge University Press. So I think that's another one. We could talk about modern work, but I'm really a fan of going back and thinking about the work that I think in many ways IR scholars have underappreciated, which is the work of Du Bois. And again, this edited volume that was recently put together by Getachew and Pitts is kind of complete collection along with commentary on his work.
And it's important to say that some IR scholars ignore it. And if you want Du Bois, let's go back to The World in Africa, his actual writings. Okay, I know the glare is coming up. And of course, it's important to mention Bob Vitalis's work on the Howard School. But it's important it's the we problem. Some of us who've been writing on this, and my first one that I wrote on this was in 1995. We've been doing this. It's not that we need to, but it's some people need to. And I want to make this point. Importantly, because we're still living in a white supremacist context, the people who get to be the arbiters of the discussion of white supremacism become white authors. What about the Black authors that you had to walk around who've been writing on this subject for 60 years and pleading mainstream people like me, or ostensibly, who've been writing on it for 30 years, and now it's been discovered. And then whites become the arbiters of determining what is the important works. And they commit an agendacide, as Ron Walters called it, another IR scholar that's generally ignored. I'm looking for his book here. There he is. At Howard University, Ron Walters, he called it agendacide. So you can't cite these folks, the Black folks. They'll say, well, you got to go cite one of the white folks who become the new gatekeepers. And I think that's important to see, to go back to the original source, but also to realize genealogy is not dispositive here. I'm really big on empirical theory and empirical analysis, but I don't knock the others, but I don't accept that you have to do it this way. Positivism is somehow racist or other such nonsense like that. But I think it's important that we recognize the Black scholars and not allow this new breed of white scholars to then determine what is the appropriate analysis to white supremacism and world politics. And that's the last thing I'll say, because I've had journal articles rejected by white editors who have never published anything on racism in IR, but they're telling me this is what's more appropriate. And that's what many of us are dealing with now. If you want to get to the grassroots issues of what Black scholars are dealing with in this subject. You can be a specialist if you're white on Black stuff, but if you're Black and you focus on that, no, you need to expand these are things we can speak to right now because they're going on in our departments, notwithstanding what Charli says about her own department, but I think in general. Yes.
Errol, I don't think I've said anything about my department, only pointed to some great scholarship by a colleague. However, I am going to want to move on to some other questions while we still have. Oh, it looks like we've lost one of our question answers. Too bad. I wasn't able to cut and paste it. We'll we'll go on to others. And I'll just build on. I think what I'm hearing on the panel is that it's very, very important to read, cite, and teach the work of scholars of color, as well as begin taking seriously issues of race, racism, white supremacism in the work of scholars who are white. So I don't think we disagree there. Looks like Craig Murphy has a question for Errol. He says, thank you. He asks, has the power of white supremacism changed over time, in your view? And if so, how?
No. Its manifestations change. And that's why we have folks, or people think there's a misunderstanding, because the dominant form of racism today is not Jim Crow racism, it's colorblind racism. So it can masquerade as not. There's an excellent piece by Tyrone Foreman and Eduardo Bonilla-Silva called "I'm Not a Racist, But." I commend it to you. I used it in my introductory IR classes. If you ask students, young folks, of a battery of questions about racism, Jim Crow racism, they score low on racism. If you ask those same students the follow-up questions, like a student asks, can Black folks live anywhere they want? They say, sure. Listen, have you ever had a Black neighbor? Well, I'm not a racist, but no. List your your best friends. It's important that you ask that question first. List them. Now, go back. Do you have any best friends that are Black? Well, sure. How many of your list were Black? None. This is systematic work on students. These are the younger folks who people think are not. So when I hear this language, and it's not personal to Charli or anyone on the panel, when I hear this language of, yeah, but there's progress, or you have to be compelled to, I don't make the argument that nothing's, of course it changed. White supremacism changes, but what hasn't changed? The banality of white supremacy. Where are there sizable portions of whites and Blacks, whites occupy the superordinate position, Blacks, that's consistent across the world. Why does that persist? I don't know. I got an idea. What I do know is that systematic analysis and world politics do not even raise the question. It becomes banal. That's what I challenge. The white supremacism in the practice. I don't care who these folks go home with, who their friends are. Look at the scholarship. Who analyzes that for somebody who does empirical work? So of course it's changed, it's different matter. And I talk differently because I don't just represent, I don't represent anybody other than myself, but coming from a housing project in Detroit and hearing these people who make class arguments and hearing these BS white liberal arguments and these white conservative arguments that are just as racist, but they're different. I'll give you one example. A white conservative argument is, why do Black commits more crime? Well, because they're more likely to be criminals, okay? A white liberal argument, why do Blacks commit more crime? Well, they're more poor. We already know poor people don't have a higher propensity of committing crime. They have a higher propensity of being arrested for crime. They're both racist arguments. Why? Because Black people don't commit more crime, you see? All we need is the empirical evidence to explore. I think folks appreciate that when you go from conservative racism to liberal racism, for some whites, that's an improvement. They need some Black folks who will talk like me, who are not trying to make friends, who just want to do some accurate work. And this is the last I'll say about it. I'm walking across campus with a white colleague who he wants to do research. He says, Errol, how do you like it here? I say, I like it a lot, except for the white supremacism. He says, I just meet him. He says, oh, wow. He said, well, you'll know more about that than I did. I said, no, actually you would. Most of the white supremacists I deal come from white folks, just like you, look just like you. He gave the best answer a person, especially a white person, could give to that. He said, that's a good point. And we went and had lunch. We later worked on the project, got a $2 million grant, okay? What people often are used to and why they get uncomfortable with me, they're used to Black folks who not considerate of white people's arguments. They want Black folks who consider of white supremacist arguments. White supremacism is not Eurocentrism. It's not race relations. It's not how well we get along. It's that mode of domination. And I want to be clear, it transforms, but the relationships, the superordinate of whites, the subordinate of Blacks persist. And anyone who does this seriously knows that this model comes from the model of patriarchy that was used to subjugate women, and then whole races were feminized. That doesn't mean that white women are somehow a liberating source to challenge white supremacism. It just tells you how white supremacism transforms, modifies. That's why it's so important to target it as white supremacism and say its name and focus there. Okay, that's where I'm coming from.
Errol, thank you. That was a really great example you gave about the guy who you ended up collaborating with. And Craig Murphy also says, thank you for such a clear empirical answer. I found the question that I thought had disappeared, and I'll read it to you. I don't know if you guys can still see it in the open chat, but it's from Dayawad Dutsy. I don't know if I'm mispronouncing your name. If so, I apologize. To what extent has there been a coordinated effort or plan from association like ISA or from journal publishers in providing bigger opportunities and encouraging scholars from the global south and non-Western scholars in general to voice their thinking? Thanks so much. ISA, I think Sarah may have put this in the chat. She says, we've run several events on this. Last week, we ran Global South Caucus of International Studies, writing and funding research. There's a link. I can put this in the chat that everybody can see this answer. But I also wanted to throw this out to the panel as well, if anybody wants to address this question about what ISA is doing to increase inclusivity, not just among scholars of color and other marginalized groups in the North, but also from the global South and scholars from the non-Western world. Thoughts? Or what could we be doing more of?
Well, I see that Deborah put a chat that she would like to say something, which I think she would be best positioned to be able to speak to this.
Absolutely. Thank you for calling my attention to that. I hadn't seen that. Hi, Debbie.
Thanks. Sorry, guys, just to butt in here, but I do want to say one thing. I was editor of the Journal of Global Security Studies during its sort of launch. And one of the things that we started at JOGS was something called a pre-submission exchange, where people who were not well represented in ISA journals had the chance to submit something ahead of time and have a conversation with one of our editorial board members. We had an amazing number of people on the editorial board that participated in that program. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting is it was beneficial, I think, in some ways, but for the scholars that were submitting. But I think it was really beneficial for us to realize ways in which the things that we counted as good scholarship really represented, a kind of closure around certain kinds of things that got published and certain kinds of things that didn't. And so issues of descriptive scholarship, issues having to do with case studies of, important events that had happened in places that were not in the United States and Europe, are not systematically thought of as good scholarship. And so I know that many of the ISA journals now do this pre-submission exchange. And one of the things that gives me the most hope, I guess, is that this is a chance not only for people who may not be able to publish as easily in these journals to get some feedback, but also for the editorial boards and the editors of these journals to get a sense of the ways in which their mind may be a little closed around what kinds of things constitute good scholarship or not. And so that's actually one of the things that I've found, most beneficial to the field as a whole, is just to sort of think through, merit is an important part of our field, but we don't always notice the way in which we use that as a way of closing off some voices.
Thank you. Fantastic. This comes from Solange. I'm not sure if there's a last name there. They write, professors, with a lot of respect, I would like to know your thoughts on balance of power in the 21st century's international system. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I can take a first stab at this. It's and hopefully I'm answering the question the right way, because there's a lot of ways we could think about that question of just like a statement about it or how to study it as scholars. And I think I might try to approach it as how to study it as scholars, and kind of keeping with one of the themes that's been here. And I think that we've heard a lot today on our panel about power in all of its various forms, right? From thinking about power in terms of race, to thinking about power in terms of politics, but also how do we study that? What does it mean to even look at a balance of power? Now, I think when most people see that question, they're thinking about great power politics. They're thinking about US-China relations. And what's interesting is I think that is going to be a big part of what needs to be talked about in for the 21st century going forward. And I recently was talking about this, also writing about this, where I think there's kind of like 3 ways that we can think about this. And maybe this is a challenge for us as scholars when thinking about US-China relations, especially thinking about how other countries will relate to that. We can often think so much about just the US-China dyad, if you will, that we don't think about, well, how much do other countries, A, care about that? How much do they want to choose sides? And which sides are they actually going to choose if they want to choose sides with that, right? And I think that in that case, there can be, one way to think about it is that it should just be embraced, and that maybe the other side should just say, hey, there's the United States, there's a rising power. We should embrace that. We should try to work with China and develop that going forward. And so that'll be a very different system than if the US opposes it, which seems to be actually the case of what the US is doing right now, is opposing it. That's going to be a very different situation. And that's also going to raise different questions for other countries. If there's animosity and rivalry between the US and China, it's a very different situation for them to be processing. And then the other one would be, well, no, they just simply go their own separate ways. Fine, you know what? If the liberal international order is just going to be a Western order, then we're just going to focus on that. By we are meaning, the US is just going to focus on that. China is going to develop its own order. Other countries are going to have to choose. There's not going to be a rivalry, but they're not going to be cooperating. So I think that those are kind of some of the dynamics to think about with the 21st century going forward, is not just how do US and China relate to each other, but then how do other countries relate to that? And I would say that is a key thing for us as scholars to really be putting a focus on, is not just, we can tend to get overly focused on the US-China dyad and not think a lot about the options and the approach taken by everybody else other than the US and China.
Thank you, Paul. Kasia?
Thank you for this question. I will start just as Paul started. Balance of power is a concept we used to speak about. We used to speak about relations between states. But what this panel has exposed very much is that power is very much present, and power relations are present in how we produce knowledge about international politics, who is silenced and who has power to say things about international politics. So I guess in a concluding statement, I think we should pay much more attention to the obstacles that scholars around the world are facing when it comes to being able to speak and being able to research. Thank you.
I think a balance of power remains relevant, because it remains relevant in the minds of policymakers as well. And balance of power is not a European concept. It goes back to Thutmose, it goes back to Kautilya and Mencius. But I'm also not talking about placism. You can have folks from the global South and other places that articulate white supremacist orientations. So I want to just reinforce that point. If you're not challenging white supremacism, you're not challenging white supremacism. It's not a result of placism. But the balance of power, whether it's Mearsheimer's notion of offshore balancing with respect to the great powers, or what I did, and again, I appreciate Charli Carpenter mentioning my book, African Realism, the way these regional power balances emerge. For example, in Africa, one of the elements of the Ethiopian conflict is also the dam that Ethiopia is attempting to build, which the Egyptians under Boutros Ghali, this is back then Boutros Ghali said, if there are attempts to disrupt the water flow from the Nile, then Egypt will go to war. He's not known as a warmonger. So there's a potential interstate conflict there because of balances that are also affected by issues of resources and resource scarcity. The mode of balancing is different in different contexts as well. I have a orientation I call neo-patrimonial balancing to explain some of the conflicts, the interstate conflicts that emerge in Africa. So I think it's important to look at regional balancings. There's been reference here to South America as well, and to see how they're different. But the logic is important, and this also speaks to white supremacism, because if the leaders focus on balance of power, whether it's empirically correct or not, if Kissinger is following that, then that logic will help describe US foreign policy in the Vietnam War, for example, or its foreign policy toward the so-called opening to China. It can describe, it can even predict. Even racist notions can describe and predict. What they can't do is explain. And explanation is so key. So balance of power, I think, remains prevalent because it's prevalent in the minds of many policymakers. And there is some empirical support for not only balance of power, but these notions of power transition as they become more prevalent, because it's what policymakers do. And that's what makes them relevant as well, even if they're not empirically correct when you think of them in a theoretical sense as well.
Thank you for those terrific concluding comments and for a really vibrant and interesting overall roundtable discussion. I want to thank all the panelists for being here. Again, thank all the attendees for your participation and your really rich questions. And Debbie, if you're still in the audience, thank you for putting this together.
Thanks, everybody. It was amazing. Everybody should sign up for the next two, which will be hopefully equally amazing.
Have a great afternoon, folks.